To understand how extraordinary this story is, you need to know who John Marshall is and how he became part of Metallica's history. John Marshall started working with Metallica in 1981, when the band was barely a band at all. They were four young guys from the Bay Area playing aggressive, fast music that most people didn't understand. They had no money, no record deal, and no prospects beyond playing dive bars and garage parties. Marshall was a guitarist himself, playing in local bands around the San Francisco metal scene. He met Metallica at a show and offered to help them with their equipment. At the time, the band couldn't afford to pay anyone, but they let him come along and help out in exchange for being part of the scene. When Metallica started getting more serious shows, they needed someone to handle their gear professionally. Marshall became their guitar technician, setting up equipment, tuning guitars, making sure everything worked during performances. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover rent and food, but Marshall loved metal music, believed in what Metallica was doing, and wanted to be part of something. In the early days, there was no separation between the band and the crew. They all traveled together in the same van, slept on the same floors, ate the same cheap food. Marshall wasn't just an employee, he was part of the family. As Metallica began to gain traction in the underground metal scene, things started to change. They signed with Megaforce Records, released their first album in 1983, and started touring more extensively. The operation became more professional, but the core relationships remained the same. By 1984, Metallica was on the verge of something bigger. They'd released their second album and were starting to build a real following. Money was still tight, but the future looked promising. That's when Lars Ulrich and James Hetfield approached Marshall with an offer. "John, we want to talk to you about something," Lars said one day after a show. "We're starting to think about the business side of things. We want the people who've been loyal to us to be part of the band's success." They explained that they were restructuring how Metallica operated as a business. Instead of just being employees, key members of the crew could become minor stakeholders in the band itself. "We can give you a small raise, or we can give you 0.5% ownership in Metallica. If we succeed, you succeed." Marshall thought about it. 0.5% didn't sound like much, and he had bills to pay right now. Rent was due, his car needed repairs, he owed money to friends. A raise meant immediate relief. Ownership meant a gamble on a future that might never come. "I'll take the raise," Marshall said. Ulrich and Hetfield looked disappointed, but they understood. "Okay," Lars said, "but if you change your mind, the offer stands." Marshall took the raise. It helped him get through the next few months, and he tried not to think about the ownership he'd turned down. By 1986, Metallica had released their third album and was touring with Ozzy Osbourne. They were becoming genuinely successful, selling albums and playing bigger venues. The money was getting better for everyone involved. During the European tour that year, Lars approached Marshall again. "John, we're doing the ownership thing again. Last chance. We can offer you 0.25% now, half of what we offered before, but it's still something. If you want in, this is the time." Marshall faced the same choice. He'd been watching Metallica's success grow, and he was starting to wonder if he'd made a mistake in 1984. But 0.25% seemed like such a small number, and again, he had immediate financial pressures, expenses that couldn't wait for some hypothetical future payout. "I need to think about it," Marshall said. He thought about it for a few days. He even talked to his girlfriend at the time, who told him, "Take the cash. You can't pay rent with percentages of something that might not exist in 5 years." So Marshall said no again. This time, the offer didn't remain open. Metallica moved forward with their business restructuring, and the opportunity closed. Then, on September 27, 1986, just weeks after Marshall's second rejection, tragedy struck. Cliff Burton, Metallica's bassist, died in a bus accident during that same European tour.
The band was devastated. For months, it wasn't clear if Metallica would continue at all. Marshall watched his decision from a different perspective now. What if the band broke up? Then the ownership wouldn't have mattered anyway. Maybe he'd made the right call after all. But Metallica didn't break up. They hired Jason Newsted as their new bassist and kept going. Over the next years, they transformed from a successful underground band into a global phenomenon. Their self-titled album in 1991, later known as the Black Album, sold over 30 million copies worldwide. They became one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, selling out stadiums, winning Grammys, and earning hundreds of millions of dollars. And John Marshall watched it all happen. He remained their guitar tech through every album, every tour, every triumph. When James Hetfield was injured in the 1992 pyrotechnic accident and couldn't play guitar for months, Marshall stepped in to play rhythm guitar on tour while Hetfield sang. He was more than an employee. He was part of the band's extended family. But financially, he remained an hourly worker. He made decent money as touring guitar techs go, but nothing compared to what the band members earned. And every year he did the math in his head. That 0.5% he'd turned down in 1984, what would it be worth now? As Metallica's value grew into the hundreds of millions, that 0.5% became a number too painful to calculate. By some estimates, Metallica's overall brand value by the 2010s was approaching $1 billion when accounting for music sales, touring revenue, merchandise, and intellectual property. A 0.5% stake would have been worth somewhere between $10 million and $20 million, depending on how it was structured. Marshall never talked about his decision publicly. He never complained to the band. He never asked for a better deal or threatened to leave. He just showed up, did his job with excellence, and remained loyal. But privately, the regret weighed on him. He'd made two decisions in 1984 and 1986 that had cost him a fortune. He tried not to think about it, but it was impossible to ignore. Every time the band played a stadium, every time they signed a new deal, every time their wealth grew, he felt the weight of those choices. His friends and family knew. His wife, he'd married in the 1990s, knew how much it bothered him, even though he rarely talked about it. She'd tell him, "You made the best decision you could with the information you had. You can't change the past." But that didn't make it easier. What Marshall didn't know was that the band members felt guilty about it too. Over the years, Hetfield, Ulrich, Hammett, and later Trujillo had periodic conversations about the people who'd been with them from the beginning. They talked about loyalty, about who'd stuck with them through the hard times, about who deserved to share in the success. John Marshall's name came up repeatedly. He turned down ownership twice, Lars said, during one of these conversations. But he never left. He never complained. He's been here for everything. "I think about that sometimes," Hetfield admitted. "We got rich, and John's still working for a paycheck. It doesn't feel right." They discussed various ways to recognize Marshall's contribution: bonuses, raises, benefits. They made sure he was well compensated compared to other touring crew members, but it still didn't address the fundamental inequity of the situation. By 2019, Metallica had been successful for over 30 decades. The band members were all wealthy beyond anything they'd imagined as young musicians. They'd also matured, gained perspective, and thought more deeply about fairness and legacy. That year, they made a decision. In December 2019, Metallica's management called John Marshall. "The band wants to meet with you tomorrow. It's important." John's heart sank. After 38 years with Metallica, he immediately assumed the worst. Were they replacing him? Was he too old for the job? Had he made a mistake somewhere? He barely slept that night, running through possibilities in his mind. The next day, he arrived at Metallica's headquarters in the Bay Area. He was led to a conference room where all 4 band members were waiting: James Hetfield, Lars Ulrich, Kirk Hammett, and Robert Trujillo. The room felt heavy with anticipation. Marshall sat down, trying to read their expressions. Hetfield spoke first. "John, you've been with us for a long time, basically." Marshall nodded, his stomach tightening. This sounded like a thank you for your service conversation.
"We want to talk to you about something that's been bothering us for years," Lars continued. "Back in 1984, we offered you 0.5% ownership in the band. You said no, and we understood why. You needed money immediately. Then in 1986, we offered 0.25%, and you said no again." Marshall's face flushed. Why were they bringing this up now? To remind him of his mistakes before letting him go? "For 35 years, we felt bad about that," Hetfield said, his voice sincere. "You made those decisions because you were in a tough financial situation. You needed cash to survive, and we respected that. But it never felt right to us that you missed out on ownership just because you couldn't afford to take the risk." Marshall's confusion must have shown on his face because Kirk jumped in. "What we're trying to say is, we've decided to give you that ownership anyway. The full 0.5% we offered in 1984, retroactive to 1984. The words didn't register immediately. Marshall stared at them, waiting for the punchline. "We've had our financial team work out what that would be worth," Robert added. "Based on our current valuation and what 0.5% would have earned over 35 years, including touring revenue, album sales, merchandise, everything, we're talking about approximately $15 million. Marshall's hands started shaking. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because you were loyal when loyalty was all we had," Hetfield said. "You stuck with us through the worst times, through Cliff's death, through all the lineup changes, through the struggles. You never complained about the money, you never asked for more, you just showed up and did your job with excellence for 38 years. "This isn't charity," Lars added. "This is what should have happened in 1984. We're just correcting a mistake. Not your mistake, but a circumstance that put you in an impossible position." Marshall couldn't speak. Tears started rolling down his face. "You earned this," Kirk said gently, "not by contract, but by being part of this family for almost 4 decades. The legal paperwork was already drawn up. Metallica had structured it so that John Marshall would receive ownership equivalent to what he would have held if he'd accepted the original 1984 offer, including his share of all revenue generated since then. The details were complex, but the bottom line was simple. John Marshall, the guitar tech who'd made minimum wage in 1981, was now a multi-millionaire, not because of luck, not because of a contract, but because the band he'd served loyally for almost 40 years believed he deserved it." When Marshall finally composed himself enough to speak, he asked, "Did I do something to deserve this? I mean, beyond just doing my job?" "That's exactly the point," Hetfield replied. "You did your job with integrity and loyalty for 38 years. In our business, that's rarer than you think. A lot of people leave when better opportunities come up. A lot of people ask for more. You never did. You just stayed." Marshall signed the papers that day. The transfer was official. After 35 years of regret, the decision he'd made in 1984 had been reversed, not by him, but by the people he'd chosen to stand beside. The story remained private for several months. Metallica didn't publicize it, and Marshall didn't talk about it, but eventually word leaked out through the music industry grapevine. When fans learned what Metallica had done, the response was overwhelming. "This is the most rock and roll thing I've ever heard," one fan wrote. "They rewarded loyalty with wealth. That's how it should work." Others pointed out how rare this was in the music industry, where crew members are often treated as disposable and rarely share in the massive profits generated by successful tours and albums. For Marshall, the money was life-changing, but the gesture meant even more. "They didn't have to do this," he said in a rare interview about the situation. "Legally, morally, they had no obligation. I'd made my choice, but they felt I deserved to benefit from the success I'd helped build, and they made it right. That tells you everything about who they are." For Metallica, the decision reflected a philosophy they'd developed over decades of success. They'd seen too many stories of bands that got rich, while the people who'd helped them along the way got nothing. They'd watched relationships destroyed by money, loyalty ignored in favor of profit. We're in a position where we have more money than we'll ever need, so the question becomes, what do you do with it? You can hoard it, or you can share it with the people who were part of the journey. For us, the answer was obvious. John Marshall's story became an inspiration within the music industry. Other bands started looking at how they compensated their long-term crew members. Conversations about equity and profit sharing became more common. But beyond the industry impact, the story resonated with anyone who'd ever made a decision they regretted, anyone who'd ever chosen immediate necessity over long-term potential. Marshall's story proves that sometimes the choices you regret can be redeemed, not through your own actions, but through the generosity of people who remember your loyalty when they had nothing and choose to share with you when they have everything. Two decisions in 1984 and 1986 haunted John Marshall for 35 years, but in 2019, those decisions were forgiven, corrected, and transformed into a testament to what loyalty, integrity, and generosity can create when they come together. John Marshall is still Metallica's guitar tech. He still shows up for tours, still tunes guitars, still does his job with the same excellence he's demonstrated for 4 decades. The only difference is, now he owns a piece of the band he helped build. And when people ask him if he regrets saying no in 1984, he has a new answer. I regretted it for 35 years, but looking back now, those decisions led me here. They tested my loyalty, and that loyalty was rewarded in a way I never expected. I wouldn't change anything. That's the power of loyalty recognized. That's the power of generosity extended. That's what happens when success doesn't forget the people who were there before the success arrived. John Marshall made 2 decisions that cost him a fortune, but 35 years later, Metallica gave him back that fortune and something more valuable, the knowledge that his loyalty had meant something all along.